Good evening, First Baptist Live and online family. How you guys doing today? You doing good? All right, number one, we have these plants here. If you want to come grab them, please grab these plants. We have no use for them, so yeah, come grab these plants. I have a few announcements to make. So this Sunday, so just to let you all know, we are doing camp. We have camp. I'm about to fall off the stage. We have camp from July 5th through 9th. We are going to a place in Petersburg, Virginia called Camp Kahuki. I did not come up with that name. It's the actual name of the place. And we are going to be having a bake sale following service on Sunday. So please take a look at all of our baked goods and buy some so we can help pay for some kids for camps. We also have sponsor a kid, so you can also sponsor a kid or give how much ever you want. To sponsor a kid, the full price is $200, but we will take anything, honestly. So thank you all for that. And also, obviously, we have offering. So we probably have an offering bowl over there if you want to drop anything in. And that should be all. I know that Pastor Ron, he is doing his thing right now, but he wishes his love to you all. So we are about to start this Experiencing God video. Let's get it rolling.
I had a wonderful experience when I served as a pastor of a church. And after several years of serving in the last church where I was called to go and be the president of a seminary. And so I moved my family to the town where the seminary was and began to minister there. But I was missing being a pastor. I enjoyed being people's minister that cared for them and was a part of their family. And I enjoyed preaching every week. And so I was beginning to just miss the opportunity to speak and hadn't preached for a couple of Sundays since I'd moved to this new assignment. And so one afternoon, my pastor of the church that I was now a member of called me and he said, Richard, I wonder if you could help me. He said, I normally go on Thursday evenings once a month and I speak at a retirement home. And it's a little service we have for them, but I've been called to another assignment tonight. I can't go there to preach. Is there any way you could fill in for me? Well, I have to be honest with you, I was delighted at the opportunity because I hadn't preached for a while, and I mean, this was a retirement home service. I thought, here I am. I've been a pastor for years. I'm a seminary president. I have a PhD. I will not just preach a sermon for these folks. I will address every major life issue that they may be facing. And so I began to prepare a sermon, pull down commentaries, and working on this sermon of all sermons. And at one point I was talking to my wife, Lisa, and I said, Lisa, just so that you know, tonight in the evening after dinner, I'm going to have to slip out for an hour or so and minister to a retirement home, and then I'll be back. And she thought for a moment and said, well, maybe the kids and I should come with you. That sounds like fun. We've missed hearing you preach, and maybe we should just make this a family outing. Now, I wish I could tell you that I was delighted with that, but I said, Lisa, no, you can't come with me. I said, it's not going to be fun. We're going to be ministering, I said. And she said, well, we'd like to come anyway. And I said, well, if you're there with the kids, you're going to want to just go home as soon as it's over. And I said, there'll be all kinds of people lining up to talk to me and ask questions, and they'll have all kinds of issues of life and death, and I can't have you tugging on my sleeve saying we want to go home now. I said, because I'm going to wait until every last person has had their question answered fully and to their satisfaction, and you just can't be rushing me when I'm ministering that way. And she said, it's all right. She said, we'll bring books to read, and you won't even know that we're there. So I agreed, and we went that night, and I've never had a service quite like that, because as I was preaching, it was the first time where the congregation never looked at me. It was as if everybody was looking sideways. I almost went out to the front of the building to see if this was a home for people with neck conditions or something. Finally, I looked the way that they were looking, and I realized they were all looking at my family. Now, we had a beautiful 2-year-old daughter, Carrie, and my wife had dressed her up in a nice dress at my mother had made her, and the boys were all slicked up, and these senior citizens were just enamored with my kids. There was a lady right behind my daughter, kept reaching out and touching the frills on her little dress, and there were two older men that were having a pretend gunfight with my boys and ducking behind and shooting at them. There was a woman blowing kisses at my daughter. It was just, no one was paying attention to me. Finally, I just felt so neglected and so on that I just closed the service. I just finished my sermon early. I never even gave them the Greek word on retirement I had been working on. I just said, fine then, no Greek for you. And we shut it down. And then as we're dismissing, I said, some of you may want to meet my family. They're over here. I got about halfway through the sentence, and there was a stampede of senior citizens all making their way, surrounding my family. They're talking to my kids. They're trying to tell my boys some jokes. They're touching my daughter's dress and telling her how beautiful she is and talking to my wife. Not one person came to talk to me. I was standing completely alone, not one person. After a while, I realized my work was done. I was ready to go, so I had to make my way through the crowd to where my wife was. I said, Lisa, I'm ready to go now. She said, well, we can't go until we've talked to every person that wants to talk to us. She said, you should have brought a book. And so I'm just kind of standing there, just kind of waiting around till my kids and wife are finished. And then all of a sudden I turned and I saw something that just stopped my heart, because there was an older woman and she had a push cart with the handles that came up about here, and there was a basket for her to carry things in, and she was pushing it very feebly down this very long hallway, and that was fine, except inside her basket was my 8-year-old son, Mike. And I could just see this poor woman having a heart attack or a hernia, and us getting in all kinds of big trouble for that. And so I just yelled at Mike. I said, Mike, get out of that woman's basket. And she turned around and she said, oh, no, that's all right. She said, it's okay. I told him to get in. She said, I'm giving him a ride, she said. And she turned and she said, tell me if I'm going too fast now. And she's pushing along and I looked at my son. He kind of shrugged his shoulders as if to say, Dad, what could I do? The lady told me to get in her basket. Don't leave without me, Dad. He says, stay close by. And he made his way all the way down that hallway. When they got to the end of the hall, I yelled over and said, Mike, get out of the woman's basket. Remember to say thank you. And she turned and said, oh, that's all right. She said, I'll bring him back. And then she began to slowly turn around. And by the time she got all the way back to where we were waiting, everybody else had already left and vacated the place. So I quickly grabbed my son and yanked him out of the basket. I said, say thank you. And I turned to the woman and said, you probably will want to get going now. I imagine it'll take you a while to get back down that hall to your room. And she looked at me with surprise and said, well, I've got to give a ride to the other two children. And so my 6-year-old son, Daniel, dutifully climbed in and waved goodbye. I said, Dad, stay close by. Don't leave me. And by the time Carrie came back for the final ride, they were making announcements over the intercom system. If you're still on the premises, you should already have left the place. These people are trying to go to sleep. So we hurriedly made our way out the door, went to our car. As we're backing out of that darkened parking lot there in that evening, all of a sudden my son Mike kind of broke the silence and he said, Dad, why did those people do that? And how do you answer a question quite like that? I thought for a moment. I said, well, Mike, tonight God knew that there were a bunch of people who needed joy, and he knew you could give it to them. And I realized on that particular night, these folks didn't need a sermon. They didn't need any theology, any Greek word studies. They needed joy. And God realized I had a lot of things to give, but joy wasn't necessarily one of them that night. But my kids did, and God used them. And it opened my eyes to realize that even though I was the professional minister who might even be asked to go and preach, that God was at work in all of my family. And that he at times might actually use my 2-year-old daughter, Carrie, in ways far more powerfully than he would use me, even though I was preaching the sermon. And in this unit, as you have been studying it, what you have seen is that God is at work all around us. And as you come to the end of this study, what we have wanted to just encourage each of you with is this basic truth. This study that you have been involved in is not so that you can fill your head with new doctrines about God, new ways of looking at God. It is a way of living every day where you open your eyes to see what God is doing all around you. It's a lifestyle that you practice every day. Jesus said in Mark chapter 8, verse 18, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? What Jesus was saying is, the Son of God is right here in your midst. He's teaching words that come straight from heaven. He is exercising power that comes right from the throne of God, but some of you don't see it. Some of you aren't hearing it. Why is it that when God works, there are those who immediately recognize the activity of God and they position their lives and get involved in what God is doing? There are times when God has a message for His people, and there are some who immediately recognize it as such and respond to it, and there are always others who miss it entirely. Seeing where God is at work is something that we do every day, not once a month or once a year. Every day we get up from bed, we ask ourselves, God, where are you at work in the world around me today? And is there any more important place for you to recognize the activity of God than in your own family, in your spouse's life, in your children's lives, in your workplace? All that we have tried to teach you is extremely practical. And what I've come to realize is that in my spouse's life, for instance, my wife's life, I want to know where God is working. And for those of us who have a life partner, we need to understand that when we become married, we become one flesh, do we not? And when God begins to do something in your spouse's life, that impacts you too, doesn't it? And yet it's amazing to me how many Christian couples will tell me that they will talk every night over dinner about what is happening with their favorite sports team, what the weather is like, what's happening at work, but they won't talk about the activity of God. And I've come to realize that that's something that we have to just practice. We have to be intentional about. And in your own, if you are someone that is married, there are various questions you can ask, aren't there? Just periodically, what has God been saying to you lately? As you've been in God's Word, what has God been saying to you? Or perhaps after a church service, you might say to your spouse, you know what, you seem to be so intent today on the pastor as he was preaching. It just seemed like you were particularly engaged today. Was there something God was saying to you that was just out of the ordinary, that was specifically touching your life? But a lot of times we don't do that, do we? We don't think in terms of what is God doing in my spouse's life today. And when you pray for your spouse, do you say, God, is there something you're doing right now that I need to be a part of, that I can join you in and be a part of? Because if there was any work that you would be doing that I would want to participate in, it would be when you're working in my family's life. And yet oftentimes people who've been Christians for years, it never dawns on them to ask that question. We should be concerned about what God is doing around the world and in people groups who've never heard the gospel, but what about in our children and our spouse we see every day? And then, of course, when we go into the workplace, we realize oftentimes people will say, well, I'm not a minister. I work for a living. I go to the marketplace. I'm in business. But my father and I would both say that today perhaps the greatest movement and working of God that we see is in the marketplace. It's not in the church on Sunday mornings. It's as people go out into the world and they rub shoulders with people in all the different varieties of the workplace, and they represent Christ and they share the hope of the gospel. And we have worked with many who have discovered that the mission field is right where they've been working, perhaps even for years. I was speaking in a church several years ago, and on a Sunday night, I made the comment, I said, God is at work where you go to work every day. Have you recognized, have you asked God to open your spiritual eyes so that you see what God is doing where you're at work every day? Well, there was a man in the congregation that night who had been in his company for 12 years. And I discovered later that he sort of skeptically said to himself, well, that preacher's never been where I work. Because I've been there for 12 years and I've never even met another Christian. That's one of the most profane, carnal, blasphemous places you'd ever want to go to in a workplace. And he kind of shrugged that off. And yet, as he was going home, he just felt very convicted. He'd been there 12 years, never seen in 12 years God do anything. And so, trying to dutifully do what the preacher had said to do, as I was there for a revival meeting through Wednesday night, he thought, well, the pastor may ask us tonight or Monday night if we looked for what God was doing, so I guess I better try. So he prayed and said, God, if you're at work where I work, would you make it obvious to me? And so he went to work, and that morning he was actually a little bit jittery. Every time the phone would ring or someone would stick their head into his office, he would start as if, oh, maybe this is God. But of course, it was always ordinary business. At lunchtime, he went to the lunchroom, saw the friends he normally had lunch with every day, made his way over to join them. And as they began to talk about what the sports teams had done on the weekend and so on, he couldn't help but noticing a man sitting by himself a few tables over. Normally, he never ate with that man, didn't know the man very well. But this day, something moved in his spirit to say, if you've been here 12 years and you haven't seen what I've been up to, maybe try sitting somewhere else. Try getting around somebody else besides the same old friends day after day. And so he packed up his lunch. He went over to this man and said, do you mind if I join you? And this was a fairly introverted, shy person. This was out of his comfort zone to just kind of suggest sitting with someone he normally didn't eat lunch with, but the man grunted fine, and he sat down, and this Christian got all the courage up he could and finally asked him, so how are things going with you? Well, he wasn't ready for the response. This man almost seemed to open a floodgate and began to share how his whole life had been deteriorating. This man's marriage was falling apart. And day after day, he would get home and enter into shouting matches with his wife. And finally that morning, things had reached a climax. And as he was about to leave the house that day to go to work, he turned back to his wife and just screamed at her and said, I'm so sick and tired of living in the same house as you. When I get home from work tonight, I'm packing up and moving out. I'm not going to spend one more night under the same roof as you. And he slammed the door and driven off to work. All morning, this man is just trembling and shaking because he realizes that when he goes home that night, what he thought would never happen to him is going to happen. His family, his marriage is going to come to an end. And he's going to have to face, all morning he's wondering, how will I tell my kids that I'm not going to be living at home with them anymore? And now at lunchtime, this Christian man is asking him, so how are things going with you? Before he knows what he's doing, he just sort of blurts out the whole story. And now this Christian is about to have a heart attack. He is so stressed out. He's thinking to himself, this is it. This is what the preacher was talking about. But he's thinking, I'm not a trained counselor. I'm not a pastor. I don't know how to do this kind of thing. He said, I didn't know what to do. So he said, well, listen, there's a man speaking at my church right now, and he's talking about things right where you are. You need to come. And this Christian man thought that might not be enough. This guy would go home after work and leave his family and then go with him to church. So he said, hey, how about if I take you out for dinner tonight? I have a feeling you're not in a hurry to get home tonight. Why don't I take you out for dinner, and then I'll bring you to my church? And so they did. And that night at the service, the Christian actually brought this man up to me and introduced him to me, but I didn't know who the Christian man was at that time. There were about 1,200 people in the auditorium, and there was just another person I met, and I was quickly whisked away. This Christian is thinking to himself, oh, he actually met the speaker, but I was hoping the speaker would somehow just change everything and fix him just like that. But now, well, I'll pray during the service. And so during the service, the Christian's praying for his colleague, and when they had an altar call at the end of the service, he's praying this man will come forward and receive Christ. But the man just stands there throughout the singing, and then the service was over. The Christian's driving this man back to the workplace where he had left his car in the parking lot. And the Christian is just praying silently, God, when this man gets out of my car, he's going to drive home, and another family is going to come to an end. And the man said, I don't know what else to do. So finally, as they drove up beside the colleague's car, the Christian looked at him and said, listen, before you go, just tell me this. Did you hear anything tonight that you'd like to have in your life? Did you hear anything said tonight that you'd like to know more about or to experience yourself? And after a pause, this colleague said, everything I heard tonight, I need in my life. And the Christian said, well, why didn't you go forward? Why didn't you walk down the aisle when the music was playing? He said, well, I didn't know that visitors could do that. I don't belong to this church. And so the Christian said, well, of course you could. And finally he realized, well, it's going to be up to me. And so he said, well, listen, if you want, I could just pray with you right now here in the car, and you could become a child of God, and God could forgive you for everything that you've ever done, every unkind word you've ever said, every unkind thought, and you could be made new and have a whole new beginning. The man said, well, tell me what to pray. And there in that darkened parking lot, that Christian businessman led his colleague to the Lord. And then the man said, I've got to go. He said, my wife and kids need to meet the new dad, the new husband that I intend to be. And he left. Well, I met this Christian the next day, the businessman. I didn't know who he was until the next morning I started getting calls. We have got one excited church member. And when I talked to this man, he had eyes filled with tears. He said, I worked in that place for 12 years, and I realized today God has been at work the whole time. I just didn't see him. It wasn't that God wasn't there. It was that I didn't see what he was up to. And I wasted 12 years. I could have been on mission with him if only my eyes had been open to see what he was doing. Let me just encourage you as you come to the end of this study. God is at work all around where you are, in your family, in your workplace, in your neighborhood. He is at work. And what we need to pray is, oh God, would you open my eyes to see what you're doing? And when I see, God, help me to have the courage to join you and to be a part of the great work that you're doing. The course, Experiencing God, is not the end. Don't come to Unit 12 and then say, well, I'm so sorry that it's all over. It's not over. It's just begun. Now you've seen how a believer can walk with God as God is going about redeeming people and claiming them for himself. And now as you end this study, go out into a life that is on purpose every day, watching to see where God is at work, and then joining him and seeing God do through your life what you would never have believed might have been possible.
Okay. Hello to everybody online. It's good to have you guys with us, and you can jump on the Zoom call with Pastor Rick back there. Well, he's not back there with you guys. He'll be in front of you on the Zoom call. And we have with us playing the role of Dan McCoy tonight, we have Kevin Kleinoff. And as always, we have Kurt and Warren that are going to be able to head up groups as well if they're just really dependent on what you guys want to do. And we have a light group, which we expected. Holiday week, here we go. So, this also concludes our study with Experiencing God. Again, if you're like me, finish the race. It'll probably take me the rest of the year to get through the book. But, it's one of those things that discipline is not necessarily the easiest part of being a disciple. So, just continue to work through it, because it is really good material, and understanding identifying where God is at work and then joining him there, and then wanting to do his work and focus on that. What is it that God wants from us? And just continuing to question those things, because sometimes, the practice of church and what God wants are not necessarily completely aligned. So keep your mind open and keep focused on it, because it's very enjoyable study so far. Go ahead and break into your groups, and if you guys want to shut the online chat down, and everybody head over to the Zoom call. And it's great seeing everybody.